Let's deal with the random and let's deal with the mistakes. So the randomness, there's a lot of human evolution, which is there's not really a reason for it. Nature is wild and it does things, and some things it does are just random. It's like you're copying something down and your pen slips. And when you're dealing with copying genes from one generation to the next, there's lots of stuff going on, and there's lots of things that happen. And when they put mistakes in quotes, the mistakes part is also, it's in quotes because it's not necessarily a mistake, it's just the process of life. And well, now we need to talk about the thing that we all hear about, which is natural selection. So, in the last part, we actually talked about the mechanisms of inheritance, and we talked about Mendel's work on genes and the dominant recessive thing. The other part of evolution, of course, is the Darwinian idea, or the idea from Charles Darwin, of natural selection. What does natural selection depend upon? What do you need to have natural selection? We actually went over this a tiny bit, but what's the ground condition for natural selection? You need variation. This is something that a lot of people skip over. But if every generation was the same as the preceding one, if we were just mixing cans of paint together and it was all blurring out, then there wouldn't be any traits to select for. The environment, of course, is super important, but if there's no difference between the individuals responding to the environment, then you can't get natural selection. So those people who want to eliminate variation and diversity are weird because it's anti-evolution. So natural selection depends upon the fact that the children, the offspring, are not exact copies of their parents. And you probably are thankful for that. You don't want to be an exact copy of your parent. You don't want to look just like your sister or your brother or whoever. And so we talked about how one of the ways this happens is because of the complex recombinations of genetics when we have sexual reproduction. You have that meiosis process, which deals out the cards randomly. And then you have that crossing over process, which sometimes swaps genes, even chromosomes, even before they're dealt out. So that gives us some of the variation. But a little bit of the other variation comes to us from mutations, that just things that, to say that things are going wrong, that's, I guess, again, I just want to emphasize, as part of the random process of life, a lot of random things happen during this, and mutations are one of these. What do we usually believe when we say the word mutation? It does have a lot of negative connotations. It sounds like something's gone wrong. It's not necessarily something that is good that is happening, but in fact, mutations can be classified. Most mutations are neutral. They don't do anything. They're just little changes. They may not have any phenotypical effects. They're just neutral. Many mutations are what we call deleterious. They're bad. They're not good. You don't want them. And oftentimes, if that's the case, they do go away during natural selection. But some mutations might give you an advantage in a different situation. And again, this is just randomly, we don't know. How do we know? What determines whether a mutation might be advantageous or bad or good? So this is very important because whether it is classified as good, bad, or good or bad depends upon the environment in which it happens. So a mutation that results in, say, slightly lighter skin, slightly less sun reflectiveness, as we'll talk about, might be advantageous if you live in an environment where you need more vitamin D and there's not a lot of sunlight around. However, if you live in an environment where there's a lot of UV and you get stuck with a light skin mutation, that's probably going to be bad. It's not good. And so, as our textbook says, it is advantageous or not within a given environment. And so whether a mutation is going to be good or bad depends upon, as Grimm told us, the environment in which the organism is being raised. So you have this natural selection process, which depends upon diverse organisms being around, variation, and then whether the environmental conditions favor that or not. And so the result of this is what the biologists call fitness. Now, again, like other terms, fitness to us usually has this very positive connotation. In fact, most of us think of natural selection, or the first phrase that comes to mind probably is this idea of survival of the fittest, which was actually a phrase that Darwin adopted from Herbert Spencer. He didn't originally like that phrase that much. But actually, in biology, fitness is simply the success of an organism in passing its genes to offspring. So when biologists talk about fitness, they aren't trying to rank organisms on a scale or decide what is fittest or not. It simply means that the gene frequencies are changing from generation to generation. And so if an organism that is successful, let's give an example. If you are a super fit athlete who can run triathlons but don't have any children, your evolutionary fitness is zero. It's not simply the way it is. Whereas if you have no athletic ability and you don't seem fit at all, but you happen to have 4 or 5 children, you have been successful in passing genes on to offspring, and you will have a much greater fitness than that athlete we were talking about. So again, the ways in which biology uses the word fitness is quite different from the ways in which we use it. For example, what is the blue eye advantage that people have those blue eyes? Yes. Yeah, what's the advantage? Trick question, there is no advantage. Remember, it's like having dimples. But if we start to think that there's an advantage, if we think that blue eyes mean something, what are we more likely to end up in? Yeah, ethnocentrism. We're probably going to end up in being a Nazi. And we don't want to be a Nazi, folks. We just don't. I know some people like it these days, but just don't do it. There is not an evolutionary advantage to blue eyes and dimples. It just doesn't work that way. So we have to be very careful with these things, because evolution has been misused in the weirdest ways by people who want to actually eliminate the diversity that it depends upon. So when we think about evolution, we've actually adopted, again, this idea of survival of the fittest, but it actually doesn't describe the evolutionary process very well. The other thing, as I've been talking about, the mutations are random, but there's lots of other random stuff that happens in evolution for no real reason. What's one of those weird things that just happened? Genetic drift. Yeah, so there's some things that perhaps get selected for over time, and other things that certain populations start to develop dimples and then they move off and the genetics drift around and gets concentrated in certain populations. Your textbook mentions the notion of founder effect. Let us say that a bunch of people with dimples move to an island like Staten Island, and they're the first people there, and they just reproduce among themselves on Staten Island for a while. It can lead to increased frequencies of a genetic trait, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad. It just happens to be concentrated in that area. They discuss genetic bottlenecking, in which some populations get stuck in certain areas. So there might be a migration that is happening, but certain individuals of the species or certain parts of it get contained in certain areas. And then, of course, we as human beings are united by almost constant gene flow across and among our populations, which can happen when different communities meet each other and different individuals migrate into each other's communities. And That's one of the things we're constantly doing as human beings. How much gene flow are we doing these days? A lot of gene flow. Yeah, so are we going to have any new human species breaking off these days? No. This is a very important point that, as our textbook says, the current abundance of gene flow in humans. So gene flow means people getting together and reproducing with each other. And here, look at you all in college from different parts of New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and other places, getting together each other and resulting in sometimes gene flow means humans are now less likely to evolve into different species than at any time in our hominin history. So we'll talk later on about different subpopulations of hominins that seem to have been split off and maybe could be classified as separate subspecies or maybe even a different species of hominins. But we're the only hominins left. And so Homo sapiens are not about to split into different species at any time soon. Lots of gene flow. So when it comes to human beings, we have to realize a few things. Evolutionarily, we are actually a very young species. Homo sapiens, as we'll discuss, come out in the last 200,000 or 300,000 years. And so evolutionarily, we have not been here a long time. We have not been here for millions or hundreds of millions of years. We also, as we just discussed, have lots of gene flow among our population. We do a lot of moving around, we do a lot of migration, we do a lot of trade, and we interact with each other. And this is not something that just came out 20 years ago. This is something that we've been doing ever since we became human beings. We've been moving around, first within Africa, and then outside of and back into Africa, migrating, populating different parts of the world and interacting with each other. And what that has led to is a fact is that most human variation is what we call clinal. That was a technical term. So clinal variation is actually just another term for gradual variation. And so what that means is that the traits that we see, physical differences from each other, vary gradually across a geographical range. They change based on geography in a clinal or a gradual way. We'll be looking at this with different traits, like for example, skin color, but I wanted to pull one out that your book pulls out, which is blood types. So blood types, as we know, come in A, B, and O. Human beings are predominantly O, but there's some A's and B's hanging around. And this chart or this map gives us the population as a percentage that has O blood type. And this is mostly for people who are indigenous to these areas, that is to say, before people started transoceanically traveling around. But as you can see, there's a lot of O in this region of the world. The people who were indigenous to this area or became native to the Americas because of genetic drift had a lot of O. It's probably least evident in parts of Eurasia, parts of East Asia. But the thing is having a particular blood type doesn't mean that you are automatically going to be from one particular area, nor does it mean that if you don't have that type, you are not from a particular area. So we can see in all parts of the world that these frequencies change gradually from place to place. And when it comes to human beings and their genetic variation, if you go to a certain community, how much genetic variation are you going to find in that community as opposed to other communities? Yeah, 85%. So if you go to any local population, you can find 85% of the genetic variation within any of these parts. And so one of the curious things about human beings, which again isn't necessarily obvious from looking at each other, is that there is more difference within any local population than there is between different local populations or between different groups. The other important thing, again, we said that humans are a recent evolutionary species. Our origins are in Africa, and almost all of the genetic variation of the world is contained within Africa. So if everybody outside of Africa were to somehow disappear, we would still have almost all of the genetic variation within the continent of Africa, because that is where humans are from. So it is true that we do sometimes isolate ourselves geographically and socially, and we say we don't want to marry that person, or we don't want to know that person, or we want to fight these other people. But for the most part, what we know to be true is that gene flow for the last 100,000 years at least has always and is now keeping us remarkably similar genetically. And so, just to be clear about this, what this means is that these groups that we have divided ourselves, or people try to divide the human beings into, that we call races, there is actually more genetic difference within each particular race than there is between them. And all of us are part of one interbreeding species in which the concept or the idea that people come in these racial groups does not reflect the actual biological variation within all of those groups. Our textbook gives us the example of a researcher named Dr. Jada Ben Torres, who is researching the genetics of people from Trinidad. Trinidad is an island too. It's actually the country. The country is Trinidad and Tobago, which are two islands down here off the coast of Venezuela. And in these islands, and actually throughout the Caribbean, if you look at someone like Dr. Jada Ben Torres, and we might have a racial term for her in this country, but her ancestry is actually of West African, indigenous to the Caribbean. Also in this area, there was lots of course, European migration in, as well as in this area, in people from India and people from East Asia. For example, there were many Chinese laborers brought into Cuba and into Jamaica. And so the Caribbean and other parts of the United States are one of those regions in which people have multiple mixed identities and continue to have these kinds of intermixtures. And for some people in the United States, this blows their mind because they think people have to be one or the other. But in fact, for most people in the world, we recognize that mixture is a contemporary reality, and it's the norm rather than the exception.